They said I looked 10 years younger. I smiled the kind of smile you give when you're not sure whether to say thank you or just look away. It happened in the middle of a board meeting. One of the senior partners leaned back, smirked, and said, "Daniel, I swear you're aging backwards." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but inside, I paused. Part of me wanted to take it as a compliment. Another part of me, one I try not to listen to too often, wondered what they really saw when they looked at me. Was it just my skin, my posture, my hairline, or was there something else? Something they couldn't quite name, something I couldn't either. That night, I stood in front of the mirror, a little longer than usual, same jawline, same face I've seen for years, maybe even impressive by conventional standards. But behind the eyes, I looked tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with a weekend off or 8 hours of sleep. It was deeper than that, like I'd been carrying something too heavy for too long and hiding it well. People always assumed I had it together. Calm under pressure, unflappable in crisis. In grad school, they used to call me the unshakable Daniel. What they didn't know was I built that calm like a fortress, brick by brick. Every time I avoided a hard conversation, every time I stuffed down a fear, every time I told myself, this doesn't matter, push through. It worked for a while. I climbed the ladder fast. Strategist, consultant, partner. Flying coast to coast, fixing other people's chaos with clean slides and smooth confidence. But somewhere in that constant motion, I stopped, noticing that I wasn't moving at all on the inside. My mind never rested. Not really. Always forecasting, always rehearsing, always preparing for a moment that hadn't even arrived. I didn't realize it then, but I was aging emotionally, and I was hiding it behind a face that the world kept calling young. There's something funny about compliments. They sound like gifts, but sometimes they're mirrors. That moment in the boardroom stuck with me. And on my 45th birthday, a friend I hadn't seen in years looked at me across the table and said, "Dan, you haven't changed a bit." I smiled again. And then before I could stop myself, I said, "Yeah, neither have the questions I'm still avoiding." He didn't laugh. Neither did I. Later that night, I stood out on my apartment balcony watching traffic pulse through the city below. Thousands of lives rushing, honking, chasing. I wondered if they were all chasing the same illusion. I had been the illusion of control, the illusion of progress, the illusion that as long as everything looked good on the outside, we didn't have to deal with what was inside. And I realized something. Looking young had become my distraction. It was the one thing people praised, the one thing I could hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping. But deep down, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I looked alive, but I wasn't really living. That night, I dug out a leather journal I hadn't touched in years. The pages were still crisp, but the first entry hit like a brick to the chest. It read, "What if the youth people seek isn't who I really am?" I closed the journal, I opened it again. Then I wrote, "What if the person I'm pretending to be is aging faster than the man I truly am?" That question didn't just land, it stung. You see, we think Stoicism is about being unshaken, stoic, silent, stone-faced. But that's not what the old philosophers taught. Stoicism isn't suppression, it's awareness. It's not about running from your emotions, it's about meeting them, without letting them rule you. I had confused emotional discipline with emotional avoidance. I wasn't calm, I was numb, I wasn't strong, I was armored. And worst of all, I'd become so good at holding everything in, I didn't even know how to let anything out anymore. So I started writing each night. Not for anyone else, not for clarity, but just to let the dust settle long enough to hear what I hadn't listened to in years myself. The first entries were clumsy, awkward, a mix of questions and confessions I didn't know how to finish. But slowly something shifted. I stopped editing my thoughts. I stopped censoring my truth. And in that space, something sacred opened up. I began to feel again, not in bursts, not in tears, just in presence. I started to notice how many compliments I'd accepted without ever believing them. How many handshakes I'd given without truly connecting. How many smiles I wore like a bend. And for the first time in years, I saw my reflection with honest eyes. Same face, same body, same features, people praised, but now I could see through them. And what I saw was a man, tired of hiding. That was the real beginning, not a breakdown, not a transformation, just a moment of clarity. The kind that arrives not with noise, but with stillness. And in that stillness, I finally asked myself the question that would change everything. What would it look like to stop pretending that calm means nothing is wrong? Because maybe the most dangerous kind of aging is the kind we never admit is happening. And maybe the truest kind of youth begins when we stop running and start listening. Even if the first thing we hear is silence. You'd think clarity would bring peace, but for me, it brought pressure. Pressure to change, pressure to confront what I'd ignored for too long. That night on the balcony, the one where everything cracked open, I thought I was beginning a new chapter. But what I didn't realize was how loud the silence would get once I stopped drowning it in noise. In the weeks that followed, I kept journaling. I started observing myself more closely, not in the mirror, in my moments. Like when someone cut me off in traffic, or when a coworker passed me up in a meeting without acknowledgement, or when my girlfriend Emily asked, "Are you really okay?" And I answered with that same rehearsed smile. Every time I noticed something, I didn't feel much. Not anger, not joy, not disappointment, not even relief. I just managed like an internal autopilot was handling things for me. Smooth, controlled, emotionally bulletproof. People around me saw that as maturity, but I was starting to suspect it was something else entirely. Detachment. Not the kind the Stoics wrote about where you remain present but not reactive. No, this was something colder, more rigid. It was the kind of detachment you develop after years of ignoring your own needs, your own wounds, and calling it discipline. I used to wear that word like armor. Discipline. I believed it made me resilient, focused, superior even, but now it just felt hollow. Emotional discipline isn't about building a wall. It's about building the strength to stand in the middle of your feelings and not run from them. That's what I had gotten wrong. And I started to wonder, when did I trade in awareness for avoidance? I brought this up in therapy. Yeah, I'd started therapy quietly, no fanfare. I didn't even tell Emily at first. My therapist asked, "When was the last time you let yourself feel disappointment without immediately turning it into a to-do list?" I didn't have an answer. But I remembered a moment years ago. It was the night my mother passed away. I had flown in late, missed her by 4 hours. My siblings cried. They sat with my father, they held each other and me. I opened my laptop that night to prep for a Monday pitch. I didn't even think twice. At the time, I told myself I was being strong, keeping things together, showing leadership. But now I know what I was really doing. I was hiding because grief required vulnerability, and vulnerability had never felt safe. That memory stayed with me all week. Not like a thought, more like a shadow. It showed up in strange places, like when Emily reached for my hand while we were walking, and I instinctively pulled away, distracted by a work email. Or when I watched a father lift his daughter into a taxi and felt something sharp in my chest, regret, maybe longing, loss. All the emotions I had pushed down were starting to resurface, but not in chaos. They came quietly, like ghosts tapping at the windows of a house I thought was locked tight, and I had a choice. I could keep bolting the doors, or I could let them in. I chose to let them in, not all at once, just one breath at a time. I started small. I told Emily I'd been feeling disconnected lately. Not from her, just from myself. She nodded. She didn't push. She just said, "I've felt that in you." Then she reached for my hand again, and this time I didn't pull away. I didn't say anything either. I just let the moment breathe. That night, I revisited a passage I had once highlighted in a book by Marcus Aurelius, one I hadn't read since college. Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. Back then, I thought it meant pushing harder, demanding more of myself, outperforming everyone. But now, I read it differently. Maybe being strict with yourself doesn't mean punishing your feelings. Maybe it means not lying to yourself just to make others comfortable. Maybe it means being honest even when it's inconvenient, even when it's terrifying. I started to see my life in fragments. Little scenes that had once seemed insignificant. A coworker once told me, "You're always so composed, nothing rattles you." I'd smiled and said thanks, but I realized now that wasn't a compliment. It was a reflection of how well I trained myself to not exist fully in the moment, to appear composed even when I was crumbling, to be efficient even when I was exhausted, to be calm even when I was completely disconnected. That realization hit harder than I expected because the cracks I was seeing weren't in the mirror. They were in me. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not fixing what's broken, but finally seeing where it is and choosing to face it. Stoicism teaches us to observe our emotions, not deny them, to create space between stimulus and response. I had created space, but I had also filled it with distance now. I wanted presence. I wanted to show up fully, even if that meant showing up flawed, even if that meant being seen in ways that weren't flattering, even if that meant risking connection rather than performing perfection. There's a strange kind of strength in softness, a strength I had never let myself explore, not until now. And the more I allowed myself to feel even just a little, the more I realized how numb I had become, how much of life I had missed by trying to master it instead of experience it. By the end of that week, I didn't look any different in the mirror, but I noticed something else, a slight shift in my posture, a new kind of stillness. Not the forced kind I'd always used to hide, but the grounded kind that comes from finally coming home to yourself. That night I wrote, "Strength isn't in what you hold back, it's in what you're willing to let in." It didn't feel poetic, it felt true in truth. I was learning they had a strange way of aging you in reverse, not because it made you look better, but because it made you feel lighter, more real, more free. That's when I started to understand what real emotional discipline meant. Not suppression, not silence, but the willingness to meet yourself exactly where you are and not look away. It started with something simple, a faintness in the chest, a moment of a dizziness at the gym. Nothing dramatic, just a pause in my rhythm. A moment that didn't quite fit. I brushed it off at first, blamed it on dehydration, too much coffee, not enough sleep, the usual suspects. But the next morning it happened again. Then again 2 days later, so I went in for a checkup just to rule things out. That's what I told Emily, and that's what I told myself. The nurse took my vitals, drew blood, ran the routine panels. I cracked a few jokes, told her I was probably just getting old. She smiled politely. But later that week, the doctor called me in. He didn't laugh. "Daniel," he said, "we found some irregularities in your biomarkers, things that don't quite add up with your age or how you look." He leaned forward, pulled out the scans. "I don't want to alarm you," he said, "but it appears your cells are aging faster than they should. Internally, your body is showing markers we usually see in someone much older." I blinked. "What does that mean?" He paused. "It means your biological age on a cellular level is accelerating. Yet externally you appear unaffected. It's rare." My first thought was, this has to be a mistake. I looked in the mirror this morning, same face, same skin, same strength, but inside something was breaking down. He called it segmented cellular aging, a condition where parts of the body begin to deteriorate faster than others. It's not common, not fatal, but unpredictable. It felt like a betrayal. Like my body had been smiling politely while quietly unraveling behind my back. I walked out of the clinic in a daze. The city felt louder than usual. Colder cars moved. People talked, phones buzzed, but inside me, everything had stopped. That night I sat alone in the dark, staring at the ceiling like it owed me an explanation. What do you do when the illusion of youth is shattered by the facts of biology? I had spent years trying to master life through control, discipline, a detachment. But now life was reminding me that no matter how composed I seemed, there were forces moving within me that I couldn't predict or manage. And for the first time in a long time, I felt afraid, not just of aging, but of being exposed. Stripped of the outer shell I'd carefully built. Because if I wasn't the ageless guy in the room, what was I? Who was I? I didn't tell anyone, not right away. Not Emily, not my friends, not my therapist. I needed time to process it, without turning it into another situation to manage. I went back to my journal, wrote one line, "The face I wear is not the man I am." That line stayed with me for days. I started reading again. Not blogs, not business books. The old text, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for truth. And I found it in one sentence. Don't seek for everything to happen as you wish it would, but rather wish that everything happens as it actually will, and your life will flow well. Epictetus, it hit me like a whisper I'd been trying not to hear. Acceptance, not resignation, not passivity. Acceptance, the kind that frees you, not breaks you. I had spent my whole life wishing for things to stay in place. My career, my image, my health. But now life was inviting me to stop resisting, to stop grasping, to stop pretending I had time to become who I wanted to be. Because time, it turns out, doesn't wait for anyone, not even those who look younger than they are. One afternoon, I finally told Emily. We were sitting in the park, the sun was soft, her hand was warm in mine. "I got some news," I said. She listened. No interruptions, no panic, just presence. When I was done, she looked at me and said, "Then we'll live fully, whatever that means, however long that means." And in that moment, I broke, not from fear, but from gratitude, for someone who saw past the mask, who didn't love the illusion of me, but the truth of me. I realized then looking young had always been a shield, but real inner strength that came from allowing yourself to be seen even when you're afraid, especially when you're afraid. The next day I returned to the gym. I didn't go to perform. I went to move. I lifted slower, breathed deeper, felt each rep instead of counting it. There was no rush, no pretending, just presence. And in that stillness, I felt something return to, not my youth, my ownership of life, fully as it is, not as I'd planned. I still didn't know what the condition meant long term, but that uncertainty didn't scare me like it used to, because now I understood something essential. Control was never the goal. Clarity was. And in that clarity, I found space to feel, to choose, to let go. That week, my therapist asked me, "What are you most afraid of losing?" I paused, then said, "The mask." He raised an eyebrow. "The mask, yeah," I said. "Because once it's gone, I'll have no excuse but to live honestly." He smiled. "That's not a loss," he said. "That's a beginning," and he was right. What started as a diagnosis became an invitation, not just to age differently, but to live differently. And maybe, just maybe, that's what youth was always meant to be. Not a number, not a compliment, not a reflection, but a return to the moment, to the breath, to the truth, and the courage to face it without flinching. I always thought stillness meant something was missing, like when you walk into a quiet room and instinctively reach for your phone, or when there's a lull in conversation and someone rushes to fill it. That was me, always filling the silence, with work, with performance, with discipline. But after the diagnosis, the noise lost its comfort. The habits I leaned on early mornings, tight schedules, relentless momentum, they didn't give me control anymore. They just reminded me how much I feared stopping. Because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant facing what I'd pushed aside for years. One morning, I didn't set an alarm. No coffee, no laptop, just sat by the window watching the fog roll over the city like a slow tide. For the first time, I didn't feel lazy. I felt present. I didn't know it then, but that morning would mark the beginning of something I had long resisted, a practice of letting go. Not of responsibility, but of the constant need to prove something, to be the calm one, the capable one, the one who doesn't flinch. Truth is, I had become so attached to being composed that I forgot how to be real, so I began again. Not with goals, with honesty. Each night I wrote a single sentence, unedited, unfiltered. One night it was, "I miss my mother and never let myself grieve." Another night, "I'm tired of being strong all the time." Some nights I just wrote, "I don't know." That one hurt the most because uncertainty was the one thing I never gave myself permission to admit. But uncertainty, I was learning, was not the enemy, it was the door. One night while journaling, I wrote something that stuck. Maybe silence isn't empty, it's just waiting for me to stop performing. That sentence shifted something in me. It made me realize how much energy I'd spent managing perception instead of nurturing truth. I thought stillness would bring restlessness. Instead, it brought depth. It gave me space to notice the small things I'd been too fast to appreciate: the warmth of a cup of tea, the way sunlight lands on Emily's hair in the morning, the sound of my own breath when I'm not holding it in. I started practicing mindfulness, not the trendy kind with timers and trackers, just small sacred pauses. One breath before speaking, one beat before reacting, one glance inward before pretending I'm fine. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. And in that honesty, I started to feel more like myself. Not the polished version, the present one. Emily noticed the shift before I did. "You're softer lately," she said one night as we lay side by side. "Softer?" I asked. She smiled, less armored. "More here," I nodded, because she was right. Stillness wasn't about escaping life. It was about entering it more fully. And I had spent years standing just outside the door. One of the hardest things I did was write a letter to my father. He's been gone a long time, emotionally even longer. We weren't close. He was distant, stoic in the wrong way. He believed feelings were indulgent, that tears were weakness, and I believed him. Until I didn't. The letter wasn't about blame, it was about truth. I wrote, "You taught me how to survive, but I had to teach myself how to feel." I never sent it. I didn't need to. Writing it was enough, because it wasn't about him. It was about the part of me that still carried his silence like a burden, and in letting it go, I created space for something new. Compassion, not just for him, for myself, because I judged myself harshly for too long. For every tear I didn't cry, for every moment I felt numb and called it maturity. But now I saw it differently. Those moments weren't weakness, they were warnings. Signs that I was drifting too far from the core of who I was. And the truth is, emotion isn't the enemy of discipline. It's the anchor. The Stoics didn't tell us to erase our feelings. They told us to master them through understanding. Not avoidance, and that understanding begins in stillness. Not the absence of movement, but the presence of self. Now when the world feels loud, I don't reach for distraction. I reach inward, I sit. I breathe, I listen, not for answers, but for alignment. Some mornings I still wake up with anxiety in my chest. That hasn't changed, but my response has. I no longer rush to push it away. I greet it, ask it what it wants to teach me. And in doing so, I find something strange and beautiful: peace. Not the kind that comes from everything going right, the kind that comes from being okay even when it doesn't. That's what I had been missing all along. Not silence, stillness, not emptiness. Presence. I once thought looking younger than my age was my advantage. Now I know it was my disguise. My real strength. It's not in how I appear, it's in how I stand still with the truth of who I am. And that kind of stillness, it doesn't age. After the stillness came something unexpected: motion, but not the restless kind I'd known before. Not chasing or reacting or overproducing. This was a different energy. It didn't rush. It didn't demand. It invited, and one morning I listened. I woke before sunrise, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I opened the window and let the cold morning air hit my skin. There was no need to plan the day, just a need to feel alive in it. That's the shift I began to notice in myself. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was re-entering life, piece by piece, breath by breath. And with that return came fire, not anger, not urgency, but passion. I dusted off an old camera from the back of my closet, a Canon I bought over a decade ago, back when I thought storytelling was just a hobby. Now it felt like a calling. I started photographing people on the street, strangers' children, old couples, baristas. I'd ask them one question before each photo: what makes you feel most alive? Some said music, others said family. A few just smiled and said, this moment. I collected their words like sacred notes in a song. I had forgotten how to sing, then I started printing them. Writing their answers beneath each frame, I called it the present project. It wasn't for money, it wasn't for followers, it was for connection. Because when you stop hiding from your life, you begin to see others more clearly. And what I saw was beauty, raw, unfiltered, honest like light pouring through a cracked window. I brought the photos to a local community center. They offered me a wall, a weekend, and just like that, my stillness turned into motion with meaning. At the opening, a young woman approached me, mid-20s quiet. She pointed to a photo of a retired school teacher, eyes closed, laughing. "You captured something real," she said. "I haven't seen that kind of joy in a while." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Then she said, "How did you stay so young through everything you've been through?" That question froze me, but only for a moment, and then I answered from the deepest part of myself. "I didn't," I said. "I just stopped aging emotionally." She looked puzzled, so I added, "I used to measure my age by the weight I carried, the emotions I buried, the stress I wore like a badge. But now, I measure it by the moments I'm fully in." She smiled, and I felt something settle in me. Not pride, not ego, peace. The kind you earn, not through achievement, but through alignment. A few weeks later, a university professor who saw the exhibit invited me to give a guest lecture on presence and creativity in high-stress careers. I laughed when I read the email. The old me would have turned it into a PowerPoint, a framework, a 7-step strategy. But the new me, I stood in front of that room with a single photo in hand, one of a father and son, forehead to forehead, both laughing with their eyes shut, and I said, "This is what presence looks like." Then I talked about what presence feels like, how it heals, what performance never could, how it requires the discipline to slow down and the courage to not hide behind titles, metrics, or masks. Afterward, a student came up to me and said, "You talk like a philosopher." I smiled. Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm just someone who finally stopped pretending that being untouchable was the same as being strong. Because real strength, inner strength, comes from being open to life even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Emily noticed the change in me, not in how I looked, but in how I showed up. "I can feel you now," she said one night. "I thought you always could," I replied. She shook her head. "You were present, but guarded, like I was hugging your shadow." That stayed with me because I had spent so long building walls. Even love had to knock. But now I was beginning to live like someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to give. And with that shift, something else changed too. I stopped fearing the future. Not because I knew what would happen with my diagnosis, but because I no longer measured my life in years, I measured it in truth. And truth, once you commit to it, becomes a flame that doesn't burn. It illuminates. I didn't need to be invincible anymore. I just needed to be honest. Curious, present, alive. And as strange as it sounds, that made me feel younger than I'd ever felt in my 20s. Because youth isn't about time. It's about permission to feel, to change, to let go of who you were and step into who you actually are. One night, I added a final photo to the gallery. It was of me not smiling, just sitting in a chair, eyes closed, breathing. Underneath it, I wrote, "Peace is what youth was always trying to become." That's what this chapter of my life has taught me. That fire doesn't have to rage, it can warm, it can guide. And if you let it, it can bring you home. Time moves differently now. Not faster, not slower, just softer. There's no more rush to fix everything. No more racing toward milestones or clinging to deadlines that used to define my worth. What I feel now is presence. Not as an effort, but as a rhythm. A natural rhythm I trust. The diagnosis, it hasn't changed. My condition is still there, still unpredictable, but it no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a teacher. And I've learned to stop asking why me and start asking what now. The doctors are still puzzled. Every few months, they run another round of tests, but instead of deterioration, they found something else. Stability, not recovery, not reversal, just a slowing. Enough to be noticed, enough to surprise them. Whatever you're doing. One of them said, "Keep doing it," I nodded. But I didn't explain because there's no prescription for peace, no lab result that can measure presence. What changed wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. I stopped resisting what I couldn't control, and I started aligning with what I could. That's where the real shift happened. Not in the body, in the mind, in the soul, and now I live with a kind of freedom I never had in my youth, even when I looked the part. Because youth, I've learned, it isn't skin deep, it's soul deep. And when you remove the noise, the pressure, the ego, what remains is something timeless, stillness, clarity. Breath. These days I spend more time by the water. There's a lake a few miles from my apartment. I go there early, just after sunrise when the light hits the surface like gold dust. No headphones, no phone, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. Just me, my breath, and the quiet whisper of what matters. Sometimes I sit with a notebook, not to write, just to hold it, like a reminder that the page is always blank until you choose what story to tell. And I've stopped telling stories about who I should be. Now I tell stories about who I am when I'm no longer trying to impress anyone. One morning, I brought a letter to the lake, folded, sealed, handwritten. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for the version of me that once thought success was the answer to suffering, that once believed control was the same as peace, that once wore youth like armor. While quietly aging inside, I opened it. Read it once, then without ceremony, I let the wind take it. It danced through the air, then floated into the water. Gone, and with it, a decade's worth of weight I didn't realize I was still carrying. There was no dramatic music, no epiphany, just space, just release. And in that moment, I felt lighter than I ever had at 25, because finally I wasn't living to avoid death. I was living to meet life, fully, honestly, gratefully. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the children's hospital where I now volunteer. They'd asked me to speak to a group of teens going through treatment. I wasn't sure what to say at first, but then I remembered this wasn't about wisdom, it was about presence. So I sat with them, told them a little about my condition, shared some photos, asked them questions. And one of the boys, maybe 12, raised his hand and said, "Are you scared you'll run out of time?" I paused. Then I said, "Not really, because I don't live by the clock anymore." He looked confused, so I explained, "I used to think life was about how many days I had. Now I think it's about how fully I show up in each one." He nodded, then asked, "So, does that mean you're not really aging?" I smiled, maybe. Or maybe I'm just aging in the right direction now. That night, I wrote in my journal, "To grow old without growing bitter." That's the only kind of youth that matters. There's something sacred about aging with intention, not resisting time, but refining through it. And when you live that way, age stops being a countdown and starts becoming a testament to endurance, to growth, to grace. Emily, and I talk about that sometimes, about legacy. Not in terms of money or status, but energy. What kind of energy we leave behind? What kind of presence we offer while we're here? That's how I want to be remembered. Not for looking young, but for showing up fully, for being the man who learned to love silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because he finally understood what was worth saying. Sometimes when I look in the mirror now, I still see that younger version of me, but I don't cling to him anymore. I thank him. He got me here, but he can rest now because I've taken the wheel. And I know the road, not where it ends, but how to travel it with less fear, more grace, more breath, and more moments that feel like home. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but never beginning to live." I used to think I had already begun, but now I know the truth. I was only rehearsing this. This is the real thing, and it's not measured in years. It's measured in truth, in peace, in presence, in a kind of youth that time can't touch. Because once you learn how to live from the inside out, you become younger than time.